God is in it in the ways that you would not ever expect. God is in the hard work of it. And it feels like it's not God. It feels like your work. It feels like your choice. It feels like you have to go to counseling. It feels like you have to lay down your pride. It feels like you have to admit to all these people that you don't want to admit things to. But God is in that. And God is in the healing.
Welcome to Mom's Grab Coffee, where you'll be filled with wisdom, faith, and hope through real testimonies from moms of how God works in our lives. I'm your host, Hannah Lapsansky, and I invite you to pull up a chair, grab a cup of coffee, and get ready, my friend. We're about to speak the truth. Hey, what's up, friend? Thanks again for joining me today. I have started my morning with a pumpkin coffee. And I know, it's August, still summer, but we love getting ready for fall, right? Pumpkin coffee, pumpkin bread, pumpkin decor, pumpkin, all the things. So I am enjoying my pumpkin cream cold brew from Dunkin'. This is not an ad. I actually don't buy coffee that often because, frankly, I'm just too lazy to go. So I make my coffee usually at home in my comfy pajamas, which I'm still wearing right now. Don't judge. But every once in a while, I'll go out, I'll give myself a treat, I'll get half dressed because, drive-through. And so I got this pumpkin coffee. Last year, I tried to make a pumpkin latte from home using actual pumpkin, and it turned out, okay. I still have a lot of refining to do on that, though. But anyway, today I have a story that you don't hear very often from a pastor. I'm having an honest conversation with Pastor Jenni Clayville from National Community Church in DC. If her name sounds familiar, or if you're on my website, you see her picture and you're like, I feel like I've seen that face somewhere. It might be because she's done several of the Verse of the Day videos on the YouVersion Bible app. I loved hearing her wisdom on the Bible app, and I had to learn more about her story. And that's when I came across her 2-year affair testimony. She's going to open up today about that and what her journey looked like towards forgiveness and grace from people, from God, and from herself. And while affair might not be part of your story, I want to encourage you to listen to her testimony, step back from an affair event, and step into other choices that we might have made and feel guilty about. Here's the ultimate question today. Are you holding on to something from your past? Are you continuing to feel guilty over something? Is that preventing you from moving forward? Now, I'm certainly not saying, hey, just be like, whatever, it's fine, let go of it, it's the past. Not at all. And Jenni's going to share the really hard work she did in order to get to forgiveness and grace from people, from God, and from herself. So, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Pastor Jenni Clayville and her story. I just think it's such a beautiful story of redemption and forgiveness and grace from God as well as for yourself. Before we get into that, though, tell us a little bit about yourself for folks who aren't familiar.
Sure. I was born and raised in Seattle, Washington, to immigrant parents, actually sort of immigrant. My dad fought for the Vietnam War on our side, American side, which is, in hindsight, as an adult, I look at it and go, I bet you people were really confused about that, because he's Chinese, but he comes home and, that was a pretty controversial war in the first place. So, but yeah, born in Seattle, Washington. I moved to Portland, Oregon in the year 2000, which is where I met my husband, Brian, and we were married in 2001, and we have 2 boys. Chance is 16, almost 17, and Paxton is 13. He's almost 14. So I'm definitely outnumbered by men who are all taller than me now. So super fun times over here. Even our dog is male, Walter. So I'm just totally outnumbered. Our sons are hilarious and incredibly intelligent. If you see any of my social media postings, my kids are like the source of most of my content because it's unbelievable how incredibly weird they are, and I just love it. So, I have been in vocational ministry for over 2 decades. Ministry has moved us from the Pacific Northwest through Texas, and now we're on the East Coast. So I currently serve as one of the pastors at National Community Church based out of Washington, D.C. That's pretty much a little bit about myself. That's like all surface information, I guess.
Yeah, that's awesome. So let us dive into your story here.
Sure.
So it's pretty heavy story, but like I said, it transforms into redemption and healing and grace and all of those beautiful things. But let's start at the beginning. So what did life look like before the affair?
So the affair happened, man, it was so long ago now, but what life looked like, it's a really loaded question. Practically, everything looked fine on the outside. Brian and I were praised many times for how well we served together and how healthy we looked on the outside. The problem was like there was a huge tension internally. Everything was messy and disconnected, and not just with Brian, but really in all of my relationships. And so all of this was unseen and undealt with. I had an estranged relationship with my mom. My parents divorced when I was 7, which honestly, this is a whole nother conversation, but it was probably the best thing they could have done for us. Nonetheless, that still messes with kids, right?
Right.
And then up to that point, I don't know if I had any close girlfriends. In fact, I can say that I didn't have any because my life is much different now. When I first married Brian, I did it, and this sounds harsh. I didn't do it because I was in love. I really enjoyed his company and I really liked him. I liked him more than the rest. But because I was actually more interested in having a primary relationship with someone that wasn't my mother. And so marrying Brian meant that I could move in my head outside from under like her household, even though I don't live with her anymore, if that makes sense. So Brian to this day is the most incredible gift. And I'm so grateful that God knew what I needed well before I did. So there's just another piece of that. Another part is that added to my internal mess was that we were labeled as infertile once we started trying to have kids. And we have 2 boys right now, but we have lost more than twice that many babies in the process of trying. And those miscarriages really mess with your head and with your heart. It changed our intimacy, everything, because everything's timed for best results, right? So
Yeah.
walls go up. And then well-meaning people say some really terribly hurtful and inappropriate things, and it all just kind of adds up. And so that's kind of what was going on prior to all of it. And I would say this too, before we dive into the whole affair mess, is oftentimes people just look at the outcome of the affair or the drug abuse or whatever and go, oh, that's an issue. And the reality, most of the time, I'd say like 90+% of the time, is there are other pieces, multiple pieces feeding into that, and it manifests itself in different ways. So for me, it was in an affair. I'm not a reoccurring, like, it's not like I'm like, I keep on having affairs. It manifested itself in this way for me. And for others, it's, idolatry and maybe their children. It's drug abuse. It is in self-harm. It is in workaholism. It shows itself in many different ways. And so I think we need to be careful when we look at what we would look at as a great sin, and say, and just put a reason to it, because nothing is ever what it seems on the outside.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really, really good point. Yeah. So at this point, what was your relationship with God?
Also estranged. It's interesting because I was in ministry, so I believed all the foundational things that would label me a Christian, but I didn't believe that God was really for me. I believed he was for everyone else in the world. I really did. I just thought maybe I wasn't included in that as much, or and I think when I really think about it, I'm not in a super marginalized group. I have a lot of privileges. And at the same time, I wasn't super privileged. Right. And so, like, I kind of landed in this place where everything kind of felt weird. My relationship with Christ was, when every relationship in your earthly life is a bit bonkers, it's difficult for your relationship with an unseen God to be different. And I didn't want to admit it to myself because I was in ministry. And so what I did is I just hid my insecurities or my questions at the time. And so to answer your question, Hannah, like, I don't think I had a true relationship with Christ, with God. And I do know that I was loved and designed with a great calling even at that time. I just didn't know how to lean into that. And I'm still learning, if I'm completely honest. So yeah, that's kind of where it was then.
Yeah, you made a really interesting comment in that if your relationships with other humans are in kind of a chaotic state, then it's hard to have a relationship with an unseen God.
Yeah.
It's almost projection where you look at the relationships you have with people and then project that to God. And then how could you have a relationship with someone so much bigger, so much almost more complex just because you can't see him?
Mm-hmm. Exactly that.
Yeah. So it's also interesting that you were in ministry, but you kind of didn't feel like all these things about God were for you. So what even brought you into ministry then?
It's really interesting. Actually, when I was, I think I was 15 or 16. So when I was 3, my mom, my godmother invited my mom to church many, many times. And she finally went and she saw what she was missing her whole life and accepted Jesus as her personal savior and started taking us girls to church. And that changed the trajectory of our lives. There was definitely trauma that happened, because when humans are involved, it kind of just messes everything up. And so there are a lot of things from that church that actually caused more damage in my understanding of who Jesus was. But I would say that early on, when I was 15 or so, it became very clear to me that I was supposed to serve in ministry. I believed that my life was meant to serve God, however that looked in this world. However, in that time, there were not a lot of women in ministry, if any. I think Beth Moore was a big deal, but she was not a preacher. She's not a pastor. She was more like a speaker, wrote books, and mostly for women. Darlene Check was another big one at the time, but she's like across a huge body of water, and she did worship, right? And so, like, I didn't see a lot of women in front of me, so I got to figure it out. But I figured at that time, oh well, the only way I could do ministry is if I marry a pastor. And so my mom asked me, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I told her, I want to be a pastor's wife. And she's like, oh, like, I don't, we just didn't really know what to do with that. And fast forward, obviously, many things started opening for me to serve within the church and in ministry and outside of the church. To this day, my husband is not a pastor and I am. So it's interesting. We've swapped those roles where he is the pastor's husband, and there's not a lot of us, but there's more and more of us. So that's pretty exciting. That's how I kind of ended up where we ended up.
Yeah, that is very exciting and kind of humorous from God too, right?
Yes. He's kind of like, oh, okay, that's what you said. Let me show you something. Right. So God is good. He's good.
So let's dive into your story here a little bit more. So you are in this affair. It lasted for, I think it was 3 years.
It was just under 2 years. Yeah.
Okay. So at what point did you realize, hey, I need to walk away from this and then start to seek help to heal yourself, your marriage, and your other relationships?
That's a great question. I knew from the beginning, if as weird as that sounds, I just kind of kept talking myself out of it. I mean, it took me a minute to even admit to myself that I was having an affair because it wasn't even it wasn't physical at first. So when I give you the timeline of under 2 years, it is from when my emotions started getting involved, well before physical stuff, and then all the way till I confessed. So I don't know if that's the timeline everyone would use. That's how I use it because that's when I felt most hidden from the world and from my relationship with Brian. And so, but I knew it from the beginning. I remember, so I have a journal entry that I haven't looked at in a long time, but I do remember writing my feelings down and saying, this is dangerous and this is not, I know this isn't right. And I don't know what to do with it. In hindsight now, I'm like, well, feelings are not forever. I could have done a million different things. The feeling itself of God created us to enjoy one another. And I don't mean that in a sexual way. I mean, in community, intimacy with the other gender isn't always, it means that I have a crush and it means this is an inappropriate relationship now. I think the purity culture that we grew up here in America and the aftershocks of it have made us not really know how to deal with that well. And so I think I was just misguided in my own mind in many ways. But yeah, I would say from the very beginning, I knew that I needed to turn away from whatever was coming my way. I didn't understand what healing meant. I didn't realize I needed healing. The actual affair itself lasted just a little over a year. And then through the time I had to confess it to Brian. And I think I was fortunate in a way where I was never caught. I could actually, to this day, say I could have gotten away with it and no one would have known the difference. But I was not okay knowing that I did all this. And I don't know if Brian really loves me. Would he really love me if he knew? Would people really know? And if they knew, would they really love me? And that kind of like came to a head for me, which is what kind of launched me into the confession side of things. So, yeah.
And so what were the series of events once you got to that confession stage?
Yeah. So I remember multiple times during my affair thinking I need to tell Brian. I even told the guy that I was like having an affair with, I said, I need to tell him. And he's like, of course he talked me out of it, but I remember having that feeling even then. And then when the affair was actually, I would say the physical part was over and it had been over for a long time, but it was like still hidden, still a secret. And so I remember at one point at that time, this all kind of came up at the same time. He got caught in another affair, which honestly, like I hate this for their family, but for me, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, I had never been involved in an affair before. And so the minute another one happened, I felt this strange freedom of like, oh, like this doesn't all rest on me. And because he got caught, like his family, like the end of it was not my fault, as bad as that sounds. Like I felt like, oh, like it lightened my load. And I'm not in any way saying, oh, I'm not guilty. Like I did a lot of horrible, horrible things. And I had to do my best to right that with his ex-wife, who was a friend of mine at the time. And that was pretty painful as well. But I would say, so that happened and I felt like a slight sense of release for me. In that same time, we met a couple who are now very good friends of ours, Justin and Trisha Davis. They were maybe a few years ahead of us. I can't remember at this point how long. I think it was like 4 years ahead of us. And I had never to this point seen a marriage that had gone through an affair, infidelity, that did not end in divorce, one, or that they were still in ministry. Mm-hmm. And so meeting them gave me another like, oh, maybe my relationship could end up not separated like my parents. I had 2 young kids at the time. Chance was, oh gosh, he was 3 and Paxton was 4 months old. And I just did not want them to go back and forth and back and forth and, you know, in a divorced home. And so, I think that propelled me forward to confess. And so I sat Brian down and I remember we were at a conference because that's where we met Justin and Trisha. And that night, instead of like talking myself out of it, I closed off any possible communication I could have had with the other guy. I wrote an email to say, hey, listen, I'm going to tell Brian it's going to get messy on this side. It's messy for you, but I just need to do it. And it just was what it was, And so I sat down. I remember Paxton was in a little pack and play hotel crib kind of thing. And we had just put him down and Brian was watching TV in our hotel room. And I just said, hey, honey, I need to talk to you. And he knew something was up and turned the TV off. And that began our very long confession, my confession, and which didn't actually all come out at the same time, but started the process of that. And just our journey into healing was, that's definitely, branded into my mind as a pivotal moment for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there was also a point where you had to forgive yourself and extend grace to yourself, in addition to getting the forgiveness from your husband, the ex-wife, and other people. So what did forgiveness and grace for yourself look like? Because I think a lot of times we can get into situations, a lot of which you mentioned, whether it's an affair, drugs, workaholism, all of those things, that can create a lot of guilt and baggage for us that can ultimately also make us forget who we are as God's children and who God says we are as well. So I'd love to dig into your personal inner journey of how you got to forgiveness and grace and reminding yourself of who God says you are.
Yeah. So forgiving myself took way longer than Brian forgiving me. I would also say Brian did not forgive me right away. I think there's maybe like a lot of red flags if your spouse is like, I forgive you right away. I'm like, yeah, you didn't do the process. You didn't do the work. Right. And so Brian got some really great advice from another friend that had gone through something similar. Just said, hey, don't say it until you mean it. Don't say it until you're ready to not throw it in her face anymore. And so it was like 6 months after my confession that Brian actually just said, I forgive you. And he's never thrown it in my face since. Now, we talk about it. Clearly, I'm talking about it right now. We've talked about it for years. It's been over a decade. It's been forever now at this point. And it feels like it's easier for me to talk about the story when there's kind of like a bow wrapped on it, right? And there wasn't a bow for a very, very long time. And sometimes the bow still feels very unraveled, and that's realistic. But yeah, I would say he forgave me, which actually, in his actions of showing that he really did, propelled me into forgiving myself. Because remember, I didn't see Christ for me, right? And so it's very hard to even think that you can forgive yourself if you don't think the God of the universe has really forgiven you, which is definitely not true. So for me, I had to understand my underlying unresolved issues. That went a long way. That involved a lot of counseling. Oftentimes we don't want to do it because it's expensive. You will put money into the things that have value, right? Mm-hmm. I had to really look for sound advice, and sound advice is not necessarily what you think would be sound advice. I clearly work for a church. I believe in the capital C church. With that said, I think sometimes the advice that comes from church is not the best. So use discernment there. I found accountability, and I know that's like that word accountability holds a lot of weight, but when you actually choose to stay accountable, then that's true accountability. And I would say I had quote unquote accountability that I did not choose to stay accountable to for a long time. And so really choosing that, investing yourself into community. And for me, this may look different for everybody, but I did not have girlfriends. I had guy friends because in high school, guys were just like way easier to be friends with because girls are so mean, right? And so fortunately we outgrow that, but like there's a lot of trauma that kind of gets connected to all that as you're growing up. And so really actually putting up boundaries for years of not having guy friends. Not saying like I couldn't talk to them, but I went above and beyond in boundaries that my husband actually didn't ask for. Brian was like, well, okay, if you want to add me to that text, fine. I don't really care. But I'm like, I do. Because once you lose all your integrity, you're like, ooh, it takes a lot to get it back. Right. And so
Right.
really having community, I had finally found some really incredible, deep girlfriend relationships. And I can finally now say, I mean, my best girlfriend, her name's Mikey, which is funny when I talk about it. They're like, "Oh, it's a guy." I'm like, "No, no, it's Mikey. She's a girl." But we have been friends. Oh man, I think Paxton was really little, so well over a decade. And most people can say that their best girlfriends are from childhood. I don't have that, and so mine came after a devastation of my marriage, and so really having that community. And so for a long time, many years, it was just girls. And then I think just like maybe like 7 years ago, I started to allow more men into my life where like, oh, okay, well, we can be friends kind of a thing and not text my husband at the same time. But I did the whole like don't ride in cars with boys for a long time. But really very, very recently, I would say maybe in the last 4 years, I've been learning what, for lack of a better word, like I said it earlier, what intimacy in friendship, not in sexual relationship, but in friendship with any gender kind of looks like. And what does it look like when you have good boundaries around that? And so, yeah, I think maybe even to your question, I think what fed into the forgiveness and extending grace to myself, um, uh, the root of it for me was I had to really be willing to be wrong a lot. Everything that led me to where I was in my life at that point, um, before my life fell apart, it didn't serve me anymore. And so even though um, it felt, what's the word I'm looking for? Like I could relate to it, kind of like it felt like I knew what this is supposed to feel like. It wasn't there to serve me, so I knew that I couldn't hold on to it just because it's what I knew, just because it was familiar. And so I had to relearn all my feelings, all my discernment. Oftentimes I see people, they can't get over forgiving themselves because they are honestly stuck in a pride spiral. And I don't mean like, oh, I'm so good pride. It's a pride of not willing to do the work of being wrong.
Yeah. And how did God help you through all of that work?
This is going to sound interesting coming from a pastor. I know God was in it. I know that he was woven into all of it. The work, though, I think so often we over spiritualize everything.
Mm.
And we say, oh, that was the devil. Or, oh, if you pray enough, God will take care. Like it'll get better. God will take care of it.
Mm-hmm.
God was in this for me in the work that Brian and I decided to do. God was in it in the grief of it all that lasted for years. God is in it now when it is all over the internet and my kids know our story. They knew it early on. We decided that we never wanted them to find out through the internet or through, I mean, we were speaking at conferences and stuff, we didn't want them to find out. So we started early on. Like as they got older, we continue talking about it. If you talk to my kids, they know very much what I did. And I fully expected that as they started to really understand like how terrible all of it was, that they would be angry with me. I still expect that when they have the first heartbreak, they're going to be upset with me. I fully expect that when they get married and realize like they have their first hard fight or whatever, they're going to be mad at me. So far, we haven't had any of that. They've had many relationships and they are very gracious. And I don't know if that will be forever. But anyway, that was my long-winded way of saying God is in it in the ways that you would not ever expect. God is in the hard work of it. And it feels like it's not God. It feels like your work. It feels like your choice. It feels like you have to go to counseling. It feels like you have to lay down your pride. It feels like you have to admit to all these people that you don't want to admit things to. It feels like you're digging up the past again and again and again.
Mm-hmm.
But God is in that. And God is in the healing. I've oftentimes said this, that it feels like when you shatter your arm, like all your bones are shattered.
Mm-hmm.
If that happens and you just leave it, you are going to feel pain for the rest of your life. Now, if you go into the doctor, who is in this case maybe your counselor, right, who actually starts to do the work, resets your bones, does surgery, all of that hurts more in the time, in the beginning. And even as you're healing, there is serious pain with the healing, but the healing is for a purpose. That pain is for a purpose, because it is much more possible that as time goes on with the reset, that you won't feel pain. Now, when you get older and it rains, like my dad would be like, oh, I feel it in my bones, like when it rains or when the wet, like something happens and you feel it. Yes, there's still consequences to the choices that we make, but the choices you make afterward can determine how things feel moving forward, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And I think it is in the really small things. We can be so easily dismissive of God's hand in things.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think we have to pause and be able to discern where God is working.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Jenni, this was awesome. I would love to give people a place to go to connect with you and learn more. Where can they go?
You can find me on social media. I would say Instagram is my go-to, if even that. I'm terrible at checking messages. So it's bad. I'm pretty sure you can find me with a quick Google. I don't Google myself anymore, but I've been told there's a lot of info in there and you can find me that way. People don't seem to have a hard time finding me. And so you can email me. I would just say, hey, be patient with a response time. Got some stuff going on, obviously, in real life and work. But yeah, love to connect.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jenni, for sharing the story. I know it's a really hard thing, but you're so vulnerable and raw with it. So I really appreciate that.
Hey, thanks for the opportunity, and I appreciate that.
All right, friend, that was Pastor Jenni Clayville from National Community Church. And if you're struggling with a bad choice you've made in the past and you're feeling so guilty and you can't overcome it, I hope her testimony brought some hope into your life. There is redemption, there is forgiveness, there is grace for you. But remember, you got to put in the hard work, right? And also remember the 4 really important words that she said. God is in it. To help you keep that in mind, I'm going to throw us back to episode 22 with Amber Palmer. Amber shared something she practices called breath prayers, and it's essentially breathing in and out a prayer or an encouragement. And so let's take the words God is in it. If you breathe in God and breathe out is in it. Breathing is something we do subconsciously. Well, we don't even think about breathing. By the grace of God, it just happens. But as you're doing the hard work to heal, to redeem, to find forgiveness and grace, take moments to be fully aware of your breath and breathe, God is in it. To connect with Pastor Jenni, I will have links to her Facebook and Instagram pages in the show notes, as well as momsgrabcoffee.com/28. Thanks again for tuning in today, friend. As always, I hope you have an amazing, hope-filled week. And I'll catch you again next time for a cup of coffee with a side of faith, wisdom, and hope.